This is the Tenderloin District in San Francisco, California. It's a saddening sight. Homeless individuals fill the streets in abundance. They struggle to afford a roof over their heads. They suffer from mental health and drug abuse issues.
I'm very close to the Tenderloin, and I was really struck by the immense disparity of six-figure cars driving through blocks that had, per capita income of $15,000. And I thought to myself, this is the third world.
Oh, it's definitely gotten worse. When I first became homeless, there wasn't very much like what you see today, where there's just camps everywhere you look.
But just a few blocks away from these encampments are some of the wealthiest tech companies in the world, all while homelessness remains a central issue impacting the San Francisco Bay Area.
Homelessness is the state that exists when every other system of support has failed. California has a quarter of all unsheltered Americans. I mean, it's unfathomable, right? This is one of the most economically productive regions in human history. And I think it's unbelievably tragic and honestly a moral indictment on our community that we've allowed it to become the crisis that it has become.
In the 2021-22 fiscal year, San Francisco spent $1.1 billion on the issue. Polls report that 70% of San Francisco residents label homelessness as one of their top 3 concerns.
There's a lot of incompetence in the system. The system does not care enough about this situation to actually do really anything about it. And I make my point by this. What has changed in the last 40 years?
The city by the bay has become a city in crisis.
The future of homeless encampment sweeps in San Francisco now in the hands of the court.
To build a better Bay Area. Tonight we're looking at a mile-long stretch of road in Marin County that has come in many ways to symbolize the Bay Area's growing housing crisis.
Overwhelmed by homelessness, I decided to dive deep into the issue, interviewing policymakers, nonprofit leaders, and homeless individuals, in order to finally understand how did such a dire crisis begin in the first place, and what can we as a community do to help tackle Bay Area's homelessness crisis. First, let's look at this report, the point-in-time count.
San Francisco does have what's called an annual point-in-time count, but basically that's one day a night where individuals are counted. So that means there are literally volunteers who go on the street, go into shelters, and count the number of individuals who are experiencing homelessness.
It's a resource to understanding who is homeless, an important first step in finding solutions. In 2022, there were nearly 8,000 homeless people in San Francisco. Yet it's most likely that as many as 20,000 individuals may experience homelessness in San Francisco over the full course of a year. Across the entire Bay Area, an estimated 38,000 are homeless on a given night. But the most worrisome number is the unsheltered population. Bay Area's unsheltered homeless population vastly exceeds many other American cities. At an unsheltered rate of 67%, the majority of people experiencing homelessness in the Bay Area sleep in encampments, in vehicles, and other locations not meant for human habitation. Another important resource to look at is this one, Toward a New Understanding by UCSF's Margaret Cushel.
There was a really fantastic new report that you might have seen called the California State Survey on People Experiencing Homelessness, done by UCSF Benioff. And in their survey, they found that the median age was, 49, the fastest growing rate of any age group of people experiencing homelessness is seniors.
The report came out in June 2023, and it is one of the largest studies conducted on homelessness since the 1990s. We will dive further into both of these resources throughout our journey in understanding Bay Area's homelessness. But to truly grasp who experiences this issue, let's take a step back from the data and look into the stories. Meet Kimball. He works for City Team, a homeless shelter in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is fortunate enough to live in a stable condition with a roof over his head. But it wasn't always like this.
Back in 2017, I was suffering from homelessness myself. and I'd been homeless for an extended period of time. My homelessness started when I got divorced. I was kind of a functioning alcoholic in my early 20s. I got married, bought a house, had a family, but then I, became unfunctional. Couldn't hold a job. I left the wife and the family behind. My alcoholic mind told me they were better off without me.
Bruce, an individual currently experiencing homelessness, shares a similar story.
My name is Bruce Hamilton. I'm 54. I was given most opportunities that most people would really care for. My dad worked his ass off. I went to a good private high school, had all that. Alcoholism took me off the path of everything. Everything that I thought I would do became secondary. Just a long progression of perception problems. I've been through rehabs and all this kind of stuff. But once you're in the grip of it, these progressions lead you to a perception of your reality that is not true.
And another really difficult thing to deal with, especially with alcoholism, is, at least for me, and I think it's true for most alcoholics, that alcohol is the solution to all our problems. If I'm angry or upset, I have a drink. If I'm happy and excited, I have a drink. It doesn't matter what it is. If I'm dealing with uncomfortable feelings or even good feelings, my way to deal with it is to have a drink.
A lot of people that help. There is a lot of people that care. And it all depends on you staying sober long enough for the brain change to take place in your head, which takes years, can be. At my age, probably take 3 to 5 years. I was just recently at City Team Ministries for 4.5 months. For whatever reason, I left there.
It was, for me, alcoholism no longer worked. As I explained earlier, my drinking was a solution to all my problems, but drinking no longer worked for me. It was all pain and no fun, so I had to change.
Both Bruce and Kimball share stories that center on how alcoholism led to their homelessness. But alcoholism as a cause of homelessness only represents one aspect of the overall picture. In San Francisco, point-in-time count data indicates that 12% of individuals self-report drug or alcohol abuse as their primary cause of homelessness.
So homelessness, of course, is such a complex issue. It really affects families in so many different ways. Like, every family does have a unique experience.
And there might just be a lot of other factors in your life that make it more likely that you would become homeless.
To better understand the complex pathways of homelessness, let's take a look at this visualized model produced by McKinsey. Here, researchers illustrated a simpler way of understanding how someone can become homeless.
I think a big problem in our community is we talk about homelessness like if this is one monolithic issue, but it's not. And so we thought that these were 3 pretty distinct demographics where if we had the types of solutions that you would want to pursue for each of those communities, that it could focus our efforts a little bit more and start to make progress.
First, let's take a look at the population that is at risk of homelessness. The at-risk population is defined by people who earn 30% of the area median income. This number is based on the county. So in San Mateo County, for example, the median household income is $140,000, meaning that if a household makes $40,000, they would qualify as extremely low income.
There's 135,000 San Franciscans who are not homeless, but at risk of homelessness because they spend over 50% of their income on rent.
There are peers amongst you that are more than likely experiencing and or at risk of houselessness. You never know what someone is going through. And I think once you sit with that, you come to the realization that there is at least probably one person in my class that is experiencing something like that.
Next, there's chronic homelessness, which is what many of us usually think of when we imagine homeless populations.
And it's somebody who has been homeless without without suitable housing, without housing meant for human habitation for at least a year, or has been homeless for a period of at least 1 month 4 times in the last 3 years.
Homelessness breeds homelessness. Once you're on the street, it's tougher to get back. It's tougher to get people to let you get back. It's a real struggle.
Finally, there's non-chronically homeless, which is someone who does not fit into the category of chronically homeless or at risk of homelessness. They are usually homeless for less than a year and often do not have chronic health conditions.
For those who are non-chronically homeless, where the precipitating factor is largely economic. So how do we get people into a stable situation and quickly support them with the services that help them get back into a sustainable housing situation?
Even if somebody ends up homeless and they don't start with a mental illness, for many of them, they end up with a mental illness. They end up with post-traumatic stress. They end up with depression. They end up with, experiencing trauma. So I think, again, that goes back to the idea that we need to get people housed quickly as possible.
So now, let's take a look back at the visualization for San Francisco in 2022. We start out with 142,000 at risk of homelessness. Around 70% of them are at risk due to economic factors. Of those at risk, just under 10% enter non-chronic homelessness, amounting to 12,000 San Francisco individuals becoming homeless from a non-homeless setting. Then, an extra 5,000 are added to this number for individuals who were non-chronically homeless the year before. The reasons for their homelessness vary. The majority of people report they become homeless due to economic factors, which include loss of income or high housing costs. Then, there are health conditions, such as substance abuse, mental health, or medical conditions. Next up, there are social reasons, such as conflicts among residents, not wanting to impose their own space on others, or conflict with a property owner. And finally, there's the category of others, which does not fit into any of the 3 buckets above. It is clear that every person's story is unique, and this chart aims to show how complex the issue is while also simplifying it.
And understand that it's ordinary people who end up in this situation. It's not somebody different than yourself. Any of us can be in that situation. But there are many people I know. I was talking with one gentleman who would come to our clinics, and he was a hardworking guy and he couldn't work anymore because he was losing his sight. He had no insurance. He had no way to get health care, so he came to us for free quality health care. This is the kind of situation that we see every day.
At last, we move on to homeless exits. There's a significant population fully exiting homelessness at 10,500 San Francisco citizens in 2022. The remainder either continue enduring non-chronic homelessness or become chronically homeless. Many of the most vulnerable chronically homeless are placed into permanent supportive housing. They receive a vulnerability index score to determine their eligibility into this housing. The more vulnerable, the more likely they are to receive housing. This visualization is very helpful to better understanding the issue, yet it can be even more beneficial. The researchers who created it actually used the complexities of these pathways to understand root problems to homelessness, laying the frameworks for potential solutions. I spoke with Barry Rowader, a former product manager and government employee who is now working with Google to create an affordable housing portal.
We're trying to create a one-stop shop for housing seekers to find and apply for affordable housing opportunities in the Bay Area. So yeah, one of the biggest issues is that as hard as it is to fund and create affordable housing, it's sometimes even harder to find it. The second thing is that applications were really cumbersome. We found in San Francisco, they could be up to 12-page applications with supplemental documentation like tax returns and pay stubs, only for sort of like a lottery type chance of placement. So you do a lot of work. And then after submitting the applications, you would typically hear nothing. It just goes into a black void. And it's just not very efficient. So the last fiscal year in San Francisco, for which I have data, there were 107,000 applications for 589 units placed. I mean, it's outrageous.
If you take somebody who's been homeless for 6 months, 3 months, whatever, and you tell them that the only way you're going to be able to have your own apartment or your own housing is if you get a subsidy of some sort, and then you follow it up with, oh, and by the way, you won't qualify for that unless you've been homeless for a full year and you can document it, or 4 times in the last 3 years for at least 1 month at a time. There's a lot of people out there who say, I have no other place to go. All my services are here, all my resources here, my only knowledge of the world is here. So I'm going to hang out on the street for a bit longer until I qualify for that voucher.
Beyond the inefficiencies to provide individuals with affordable housing, there's just a shortage of it in the first place.
If there's not affordable housing that people can move to, it doesn't matter how motivated a person is. There's just a supply issue. And in some places, it doesn't matter whether it's Republican-led or Democratic-led. It depends on what the housing situation is. That homelessness is a housing crisis because the cost of housing, and certainly in San Francisco and Oakland, that's pretty well documented, that the gentrification and the cost of housing is skyrocketing, and there's just not places that people can afford to go.
If you're well employed or well endowed, and you're making $150,000, $200,000 a year, there's a shortage of housing for you. It's hard to find it. As you go down the income ladder, it becomes a crisis. When you get down to people who are only making minimum wage, it's a catastrophe. The only way they can afford the $40 to $60 an hour inflow it takes to sustain housing in this area is by doubling the number of jobs they hold, and also doubling, tripling, quadrupling up in the household. But in the end, density is going to be what's needed at some level in some places.
But when it comes to something that's like acquiring a new space for housing, like we have to find a location. We have to figure out like the cost of that. Also, you have to understand like NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. That is probably one of the bigger challenges, to be honest. In NIMBY everywhere.
Let's take a jump back to this NIMBY issue. And to really understand what happens, let's look at an example right inside the Bay Area. In January 2023, Steph Curry made headlines for opposing an affordable housing plan proposed in Atherton, California, the richest zip code in America.
No one who works in Atherton can afford to live in Atherton.
This plan included the addition of 16 multi-family townhouses on this lot. In a letter to the city, the Curry family were concerned it would pose safety and privacy issues. The Currys were not alone in their dismay. Recently, Atherton residents have endured a tense conflict with the state to implement affordable housing in a town where the homes look like this. We have to start with California's long-standing housing crisis. Let's take a look at this chart. Between 2011 and 2017, there were 531,400 new jobs created in the Bay Area, but only 128,801 new housing units were approved. This staggering 4.1 ratio between jobs and housing units greatly exceeds the EPA's recommended ratio of 1.5. As a result of this high demand for a limited supply of homes, home prices in the Bay Area have skyrocketed, specifically 143% between 2012 and April 2021.
The cost of our land and our properties is just too expensive.
The price for land is so high that I don't know if it's even feasible to build low-income housing here.
State governments understand this affordable housing crisis and have tasked local governments with a housing element, an 8-year plan to meet housing needs of everyone in the community.
And we are under tremendous pressure from the state of California to, as they say, quote, do our share to address the severe housing shortage by building 348 new housing units. Our last housing cycle, 8 years ago, they assigned 91 housing units to be built.
Ultimately, residents are trying their best to just barely fulfill the requirements so they can maintain the neighborhood's affluent status quo.
I am faced, as he and his family and many others, with the horrific notion of losing our privacy and our space.
We need to do a really, really good job this time around of addressing why Atherton is special.
Who in the world wants Atherton to encourage the cluster of multifamily developments? I mean, then, there's other cities to move to. I don't think this should be in here at all.
For Mark Anderson, a billionaire CEO of a successful venture capital firm, new affordable units will massively decrease our home values, the quality of life of ourselves and our neighbors, and immensely increase the noise pollution and traffic. This letter raises some skepticism because just 2 years earlier, he wrote an essay titled "It's Time to Build," where he criticized the nation for not building enough housing. This sort of hypocrisy often causes people like Anderson to be labeled as NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Now, there are 4 main strategies Atherton is using to meet the housing element's goals. Number 1, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which is basically a guest house with a kitchen. Number 2 is taking advantage of SB 9. This law allows 2 homes on a parcel of single-family land. Number 3 is teacher housing at schools. And finally, Atherton's multi-dwelling unit at 23 Oakwood Boulevard. It's for sure a challenge, given their current zoning policies.
This is different than it was 8 years ago. Everyone in the state of California is challenged in this.
You guys want to destroy my home, and this is over my fence. And yes, I'm NIMBY, or NIMBY, whatever everybody wants to call me, because it is over my fence. I will have people staring into my yard and into my bedroom window.
In the end, the state suggested that Atherton adds more analysis to see how realistic the affordable housing goals are. But they need to be careful because of the builder's remedy.
And that's really what we're afraid of, with the builder's remedy.
This law would strip local governments of their power to deny certain products, essentially putting nearly all the power to the state and local housing developers. Whether you sympathize with the concerns of Atherton residents or think they are just trying to cheat the housing element, it is safe to say that this story sheds light on why affordable housing is so difficult in California. The next issue we are going to dive deep into is the fragmentation in the homeless response system.
I mean, I think the fragmentation was a big shock. I mean, we kind of knew it, but just actually documenting it and enumerating it and realizing there's money from, HUD at the federal level, there's city appropriated funds, whether it's Prop C or other things, there's a bunch of state funds, there's over 10 departments that get funds in some capacity, and there's 60 nonprofits that collectively make up our homeless response ecosystem. And we're asking individuals who've been through the most trauma, who've been the most disadvantaged with the least resources, to navigate that maze and expect it to lead to good outcomes. It's just not pragmatic.
And personally, I think the state is trying to take control over local communities at a level that isn't right. The people that are pushing that in the state legislature, they're basically trying to export the urban experience in San Francisco to the suburban experience in cities along the peninsula.
So I do think there's more that our community can do to better coordinate and collaborate.
To understand how the current shelter response system functions, I reached out to Irene, an expert on homelessness who works for a new government organization aiming to better coordinate the counties in the Bay Area.
So there's a ton of different funding sources and different types of programs for people experiencing homelessness, right? There's some from the federal government that are through HUD. HUD, Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal level, gives money to what are called continuums of care. Basically, continuums of care administer federal dollars, and they are kind of set up to be, there's a federal requirement that there's what's called coordinated entry systems in each continuum of care where they prioritize the people who need the assistance. So first we have those. We have the COC, they're abbreviated called COCs. Then we have state programs. So California has way more funding for homelessness programs than almost anywhere in the country. Some of those dollars go to the continuums of care. Some of those dollars go to cities, and some of those dollars go to counties. So we have like a couple different sources who are giving out the money, and then a couple different sources at the local level who are getting the money. So at that local level, the COCs, state, the city, they're the ones who are going to contract with the local government or the local community-based organizations or service agencies to run the program. Sound confusing? It's so confusing. It's so confusing for the people working in the systems too. It takes a lot for people to figure it out.
And I think California has put, I don't know what, I saw in the paper today, I think in the last 3 or 4 years, $16 billion into homelessness, trying to solve homelessness. That's building organizations, nonprofit organizations that try to address the homeless crisis, but it also builds bureaucracy, and it gives money to homeless people to live in motels or buy hotels. I mean, the state has spent a lot of money on this. I mean, and when you look at the numbers, it costs something like $500,000 a year to house a homeless person. That's a big deal.
Bruce has lost hope in the current system and proposes another solution.
It's going to take a private funder, and I'm not saying Mark Zuckerberg has a duty to do anything for anybody. It's America. I'm a capitalist. Make your money. Have a good time. But it's going to take an extremely powerful somebody with some serious money to buy land out somewhere and create a haven, an apartment structure and all that stuff with all the infrastructure. But the only way around this problem is private funding.
And beyond the complex nature and funding, creating affordable housing also bears many inefficiencies.
But there's certainly, to go back to the beginning, issues related to production. The biggest of which is, well, okay, congratulations, I found a piece of land. How do I get the financing? So we are largely dependent on tax credit funding. So there are bonds that are created basically out of these programs, but it's not like, okay, yes, congratulations, you found a piece of land and you've applied to us for some bonds. Here's your bonds, go build that. That sounds lovely. It typically takes between 6 and more, probably more like between 7 or 8 and 10 different funding sources to create affordable housing. It's like, oh my gosh, it's very complex. And while you're applying to that program, or maybe you find out, like, let's imagine that you didn't get in on those bonds. Okay, but you did get in on those. That program has locked up those funds for you, and they won't reissue additional funds until you use yours. But you can't use yours until you get that. So it's just like this really kludgy, the financing system is really weird.
And so often people talk about federal dollars being like a blunt instrument. And the reason it's called that is that people say that is like they're trying to fit like thousands of different needs with one type of program. So that does create inefficiencies, right? Because they're trying to choose, it has to be kind of one size fits all of the federal government.
Despite many challenges in tackling the complexities of the homelessness response system, some cities have found successful solutions.
So, and we can learn from other places. Like, we're not alone in thinking about this problem. Like Houston, I would encourage you to kind of research a bit of what Houston has done. They basically created a nonprofit entity that served as this coordinating function that took in a lot of the funding from the various sources, like there's federal funding, state funding, city funding, and then was sort of the single point of accountability responsible for contracting out the various services that may be required and holding the accountability for results, right? Even if there's multiple providers.
According to the New York Times, Houston has housed 25,000 homeless people. How? Unison. Beforehand, Houston's homelessness response system involved tons of nonprofit organizations, competing for the same funding and offering duplicate services. Each individual nonprofit tried everything: outreach, case management, child services, employment training, etc. Similar to what we currently see in the Bay Area today.
And we provide everything that the working poor need to survive and thrive. So that includes things like food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, financial empowerment and assistance, services in the school, all kinds of things that we do.
But the 2009 HERTH Act stipulated that in order to receive federal funding, cities must implement a housing first policy and must work together in continuums of care, as we outlined earlier. The continuum of care that was created in Houston is called The Way Home, with the nonprofit Coalition for the Homeless of Houston appointed as the lead agency. Soon, many organizations joined the coalition to address homelessness. Organizations started to focus on different services. One organization might focus on case management, another on outreach. In the end, Houston did not have an insanely innovative approach to addressing homelessness. After all, they pursued housing first, a well-researched solution with historical success. What differentiated Houston from the Bay Area, which also had a continuum of care, was Houston's head-first dedication to housing first and an effective lead organization in the Coalition for the Homeless of Houston, which strategized funding and services.
Within San Francisco, right, there's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, there's the Department of Public Health, then there's the Department of Emergency Management, Department of Emergency Communications, there's the Fire Department, the Police Department, and more that all play a role in the homelessness response ecosystem. There's then kind of our healthcare system, so whether it's SF General or some of the other hospital networks here, and then it's all the nonprofit service providers. So I do think there's more that our community can do to better coordinate and collaborate.
Finally, we move on to the drug abuse and mental health issue, a problem we mostly see with chronically homeless populations.
I think homelessness includes that housing problem, but it also includes a significant drug problem and a significant mental health problem.
I think one of the things that is really sorely lacking, however, is treatment on demand, residential treatment on demand, so that people who are living in situations where everyone around them is using drugs and alcohol, can get away and not have to come back to that same situation. Not that they won't be tempted somewhere else, but I think it's a higher likelihood if people can go into a long-term residential program where they get the support and learn some skills and create a social network, because that's part of the issue as well. If your only social network are people who are using drugs and alcohol, how do you have a life? Where do you go when you leave treatment?
Me and because I'm an alcoholic, I hung out with other alcoholics. And our whole purpose for the day was to drink. A typical day for me was getting up pretty early in the morning and going to fly a sign. And flying a sign means holding a piece of cardboard, begging for money. So I would go hit the early morning traffic, make a few dollars, buy a few drinks, go back to camp, and wake everybody up with a few drinks. And then we would get up and go out from there. We'd usually go catch lunch at a free food somewhere about noon, and then we'd be back to flying a sign in the afternoon to make money for drinking for the night.
I think there is a strong likelihood that somebody living on the streets has a substance use disorder because, there's a level of comfort. There's also a level of camaraderie when you're, using with other people, be it alcohol or drugs. Certainly people with a mental illness, if you don't have any familiarity, the treatment for mental illness is not always pleasant, not always easy. And for some people, using drugs or alcohol is the preferred treatment of choice.
Yeah, fentanyl and meth, I think, would be the two big ones. I am so glad that fentanyl came out after I got sober. At least it was not, anywhere around when I was on the street. It's they're mixing it in everything, and it's highly addictive. And you're right, it's very cheap. And they're even mixing it, and it's killing people too.
But a deeper investment and focus into offering services for drug abuse and mental health issues will not be easy.
Every recovery needs to be custom tailored. Mm-hmm. Every individual needs to have something done with doctors and all this kind of stuff. It's not just throw an AA book at you and that's it. It has to, when I was in the city team, and I've never been diagnosed with any problems, other than just being a screw up and an alcoholic.
Well, there's probably some lack of shelters, but I don't think that's really the biggest problem with homelessness. At least in my experience with me and my friends, we had no interest in a shelter. The whole time I didn't spend a single night in a shelter in like 20 years. Because for me and the people I hung out with, the problem with shelters is there's rules to follow. And there's the real crux of the problem. I'm not sure you can. I think for me, it was life experience that eventually got me to change my way of thinking. A desperate need to get out of the pain and misery I was in. There's something to be said about forcing recovery on somebody. And I was forced into recovery at one point, and I did a year-long program. It didn't stick with me. I was looking at 3.5 years in prison or a year in recovery. And I wasn't really ready for recovery. But that year that I did do in recovery gave me a good foundation for when I was ready for recovery.
The reality is we continue offering the services as long as they, can manage their behavior. At a certain point when we really, 6 months is kind of a cutoff for us typically. So if somebody has been here for 6 months and they don't still have a path forward, or they haven't worked on a path forward, then we may ask them to leave so that we can make space for someone else. But throughout that period of time, a lot of people come here and they're not initially interested because either A, they don't have a lot of trust, and many of them have no reason to trust us. B, they have expectations for what the program is and isn't, and we sort of have to educate them.
Here, we see an issue with the mental health and drug abuse response system. Oftentimes, individuals don't want help from a shelter, and similarly, shelters are often unwilling to force upon their support for individuals who aren't cooperating. Whether you agree or disagree with the degree of personal freedom homeless people are entitled to, it is no doubt that this nuance makes the issue so much more difficult to solve.
Mental illness is cyclical. It isn't a one and done. And they would often have a problem, go back into the hospital, and when they came back out, they'd lost their housing.
The longer you drink, the more physically you get hooked on it. By the end of my drinking, if I were to not drink for a couple hours, I'd get violently ill, shaking, sweating, throwing up. And that is where my pain and misery came into play, because it was a miserable place to be. But until that, from my experience, and this goes with a lot of people that I work with in Alcoholics Anonymous, that pain and misery has to outgrow the enjoyment. And not only the enjoyment of drinking, but because it's a solution to all our problems, it's a big thing to give up.
And I think even if somebody ends up homeless and they don't start with a mental illness, for many of them, they end up with a mental illness. They end up with post-traumatic stress. They end up with depression. They end up with, experiencing trauma. So I think, again, that goes back to the idea that we need to get people housed quickly as possible, because otherwise we are dealing with all of those ancillary issues that are created by someone being homeless.
I would personally disagree that letting somebody lie on the sidewalk and smoke crack out in the open, in my belief system, that's not okay. Even when I was out there doing drugs, I didn't think it was okay to do it openly. No kid should be afraid to walk down the sidewalk and see that.
But you have to understand that there's the perception that all of these people on the streets are mentally ill is totally wrong. But there are many people on the streets who are. And those who are there because of mistakes that were made in how we deregulated and dispersed people, from what had been a hospital-based system 60, 70 years ago.
Some call for the need of more psychiatric beds, since California has a massive shortage of them. Others want to change public policy, specifically Prop 47, which decriminalized many drug possession offenses to misdemeanors. In the end, drug abuse and mental health issues need to be addressed alongside affordable housing and less fragmentation in order to see greater progress in solving homelessness. I ended all my interviews with the same question: What more can a community member like myself do in order to help the issue?
So, I mean, it's just a lot of, if people would more understand about why people are homeless versus just making a judgment and go, I don't want to deal with you because you must be a drug addict, you know, you're unsavory, you know, you're not worth my time, anything like that. But, you know, even homeless people got feelings too, you know.
You know, and everybody's individual, so everybody needs maybe something different.
Going back to the pathways to homelessness from earlier on, there are truly so many different ways people can become homeless.
You can just tell the type of support that people need is really as diverse as people themselves in our community, right? And so there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that was sort of our best attempt to stay focused, but being specific enough on what you would do that you can help a lot of people.
You know, I think a big understanding about why people are homeless, you know, a lot of, I think the rhetoric around homeless people is you must be a criminal, you must be on drugs, you must be out here doing some type of unstructured activities. Besides the most probably obvious, it's just things happen in life.
The issue's complexity makes it so difficult to solve. Better understanding it will eliminate some misconceptions about it. We need more compassion for homeless individuals. Whether you share your own stories with your interactions with homeless people, try to help them out when you see them, or simply just change your mindset about them. At the end of the day, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of those actually experiencing homelessness.
I've been homeless probably for about 2.5, 3 years now. I had a place, they put a size restriction on my apartment for him. So it was either give him up or should stay there. That's my animal, man. That's my service. So I could never have a quality of life there.
So we support lots and lots of folks. There's so many different stories that really are. But they're all people. I want you to remember that. They are your neighbors, and you see them every day, even though you don't realize it. So I tell people that if you live in this area, if you've gone to a restaurant, if you've gone to a hotel, if you had your car worked on, you had your lawn done, you had something built on your house or repaired on your house, you had somebody take care of your children or your grandchildren, those are the people we're serving. Those people who are serving us. But they're poor because it's really tough to live on their income level here in this very expensive area.
Nobody wants any of this stuff in America. And I don't blame them. If I spent my entire life working for a $2 million house, I wouldn't want me around me.
I really hate that word homeless. It's just, I like the word transit better, I guess, because it more determines, you know, it doesn't put us in a category of people's mentality of thinking, oh, you're no good because you're homeless. You know what I mean? I really hate that word homeless.
There's no concern out there. No, seriously. Concern for humans is the only thing that this life is about at 54 is relationships. It's not about money, not about big houses, not about fancy cars and all that stuff. In the end, it's all about people you know and all that kind of stuff. So.